The old man sat hunched near the fire, the glow turning his hair the color of rusted iron. Outside the adobe walls of the fort, the wind moved over the empty land, whining softly through the cracks. Men still called him a legend. They still whispered his name like a spell that could guide them out of any canyon, through any storm. To the soldiers posted at the edge of the American West, the name meant safety. It meant the man who always knew which river bend to follow, which ridge to cross, which pass would stay open when the snow fell early. To the politicians and newspaper men far away in the East, it meant something even bigger, the living symbol of the Wild West. They printed him in cheap little books with painted covers. In those pages he was 10 feet tall, fearless, untouchable. He fought off entire war parties alone. He never missed a shot. He was the perfect frontiersman, carved out of myth more than flesh. But the man by the fire that night at the fort did not feel like a perfect anything. His shoulders slumped under the weight of years. His chest ached with a quiet, constant pain he tried not to think about. When the younger officers came in and saluted, he answered politely, but his eyes slid back to the flames, as if he were watching something else entirely. Something only he could see. He had seen villages burn and heard children cry on forced marsh. He had watched men freeze to death in snowdrifts only a few steps from safety. He had led explorers, soldiers, traders, some home, some into graves. For every story the dime novel shouted, there were 10 he never repeated. On a crate near his chair lay a crumpled pamphlet with his own name on it. Someone had shown it to him earlier, laughing. "They're still writing about you, General," the man had said. "That's so?" Carson had answered, almost to himself. He'd stared at the printed words for a long time, moving his lips as someone nearby read them out loud. The bravest scout the West has ever known. The description did not mention the small, bow-legged boy who had once tripped over roots in a Kentucky yard. It did not mention the farm chores, the hunger, the grief, the saddle shop where he had felt caged like a mule tied to a post. It did not mention the night he had slipped away toward a road called the Santa Fe Trail, leaving behind the last traces of childhood. The flame snapped, and he blinked, as if waking from a long, wandering thought. People knew the legend of Kit Carson. In the years to come, they would build statues, name cities and counties after him, argue about what he represented. Some would call him a hero. Others would call him a villain. Few would think about the boy at the beginning of the story, and that is where we begin. How does a bow-legged Kentucky boy, born into a family with very little, become the most talked-about scout of the frontier? How does someone so ordinary grow into a symbol? And what gets lost along the way? To understand the man at the fort, we have to walk back through the years, through forests and along muddy roads until the legend disappears and a child stands in its place. A boy named Christopher Houston Carson, not yet Kit. He came into the world on December 24th, 1809, in Madison County, near Richmond, Kentucky. Snow and mud, not red carpets, greeted him. His father, Lindsey Carson, was a hard man shaped by war and work. His mother, Rebecca, was used to making do with little. They had many children. Christopher was one more hungry mouth to feed in a small cabin, one more pair of thin arms to put to work as soon as he could lift anything heavier than a bucket. No. One who saw him as a toddler would have guessed he would become famous. He was small for his age, his legs bent slightly outward so that his walk looked a bit uneven. Later in life, people would describe him as short, bow-legged, and not impressive to look at a man whose size never matched his reputation. But as a boy, those crooked legs simply marked him as different, easy to tease. The Carsons did not stay long in Kentucky. The land itself seemed to be pushing people west, and Lindsey followed the pull. When Christopher was still very young, about 1 or 2, the family packed their few possessions, gathered their children, and joined the stream of wagons heading toward Missouri, the edge of American settlement. They moved to a place called Boone's Lick in Howard County. This was not a comfortable farm area with neighbors on every side and a church at the center. This was frontier. Cabins had high stockade fences. Men carried rifles as naturally as they carried shovels. When they went out to work the fields, someone always watched the tree line, scanning for movement. For a young boy like Christopher, this world was equal parts playground and danger zone. He learned early that silence could mean safety, that a snapped twig might be wind or something worse. At night, he would hear adults talk in low voices about raids, about settlers killed on the road, about crops stolen or burned. The stories about the West weren't adventures yet. They were warnings. Still, even in this rough setting, he was mostly just a child. He played with other children, including relatives of Daniel Boone, the famous frontiersman whose name already carried its own myth. Somewhere in those early games, you can imagine the bow-legged boy racing around a dirt yard, pretending to hunt buffalo or explore rivers, copying stories he heard from older men. The fantasy and the reality would one day meet. When Christopher was about 8, real tragedy struck. His father, working to clear land, was killed suddenly when a tree or a falling limb crashed down on him. One moment, Lindsay was a living wall between his children and a brutal world. The next moment, he was gone. For the Carson family, there was no big government safety net, no insurance, no easy way out. There was just a widow, a pile of debts, and a house full of children who needed food. The boy remembered that day for the rest of his life. The sound of the news, his mother's reaction. The shift in the house from thin security to deep uncertainty. Childhood narrows fast when a parent dies. Responsibilities fall like stones. He would later say they lived forted for years, penned in and under constant threat. For a while, his mother tried to manage alone. She stretched every bit of food, took in help from neighbors where she could, and used her older children as extra hands in the fields. But the frontier was unforgiving. After a few years, she remarried a widower named Joseph Martin, a man with his own children and his own ways of doing things. The new marriage might have stabilized the household on paper, but in the life of a young teenager like Christopher, it did something else. It made him feel like an outsider in his own home. He did not get along with his stepfather. There were too many orders, not enough understanding, and not enough room in that small house for two men to grow into themselves. The boy who had watched his father die now watched another man step into that role, and something in him resisted. Tension filled the air. Words were spoken sharply. The house, already crowded, felt even tighter. The answer, in the minds of the adults, was simple: send the boy to learn a trade. So, around the age of 14, Christopher was bound out as an apprentice to a saddle maker named David Workman in the river town of Franklin, Missouri. Franklin sat at the eastern end of a new road that would soon become legendary. The Santa Fe Trail. The arrangement probably seemed reasonable to everyone but the boy. He would learn skills, earn his keep, and stop clashing with his stepfather. But for Christopher, stepping into that saddle shop was like stepping into a cage built out of leather and wood shavings. Day after day he worked in the dim light, the smell of hides and glue filling his nose, his bow-legged frame bent over benches and tools. He patched, stitched, and hammered, shaping saddles for men who would ride into the lands he had only heard about in stories. Traders, trappers, and wagon masters passed through, leaving silver coins and big tailies behind. They spoke of New Mexico, of Spanish towns and desert skies, of wild rivers and dangerous passes, of Comanche, Apache, and other native nations who ruled the plains. They talked about fortunes made in furs and goods, about risks and rewards that sounded nothing like scraping by in a saddle shop. Christopher listened. He listened as he scraped and stitched, as he wiped sweat from his forehead and watched dust motes dance in the light from the door. The men laughed, cursed, slapped each other on the back. They were sunburned, scarred, missing teeth, missing fingers, but their eyes were alive with something. He did not see in the faces of men who stayed put freedom, or at least the promise of it. At night, maybe he lay on his thin mattress and traced maps in his head. East was the river and the towns he knew. West was a wide, uncertain emptiness filled with dangers and possibilities. He knew the risks. Everyone did. Men disappeared out there. Some came back crippled. Some never came back at all. The trail took as much as it gave. And yet, the longer he worked in that shop, the more the walls seemed to press in. He was small, yes. Bow-legged, yes. Not built like the tall, broad-shouldered heroes people imagined. But inside, something stubborn grew. A feeling that he could not spend his life nailing down saddles for other men to chase their dreams on. The decision, when it came, was quiet. It was August 1826, and Christopher was about 16. A caravan of traders and trappers was preparing to set out from Franklin, bound for Santa Fe, deep in Mexican territory. They needed men to help drive the animals, cook food, and handle camp chores. They did not need him as a master guide or a gunfighter. They needed hands. Hands he had, somewhere between the creak of leather and the clink of tools. The idea turned from a dream into a plan. He knew his mother would not approve. She had already lost one man to the dangers of the frontier. Letting her boy walk into that same danger would feel like tearing open the same wound, and his master workman would see it as a betrayal. Apprentices were not supposed to wander off in search of adventure, but in the end, the pull of the trail was stronger than the pull of the shop. Maybe it was in the pale light before dawn. Maybe it was in the heat of an August afternoon. However it happened, one day the young, bow-legged apprentice put down his tools and did not pick them up again. He slipped away from the saddle shop and joined the caravan as a lowly helper, bound for lands he had only imagined. No big speeches, no goodbye party, just a boy stepping into a line of wagons filled with goods and guarded by men who already had more scars than he had years back in Franklin. Workman was angry enough to place a small notice in the paper, offering 1 cent to anyone who brought the runaway apprentice back. It was meant as a joke as much as anything else, a sign of how little power he truly had to drag Christopher home. No one claimed the reward. The road stretched out in front of the caravan. Dust rose, wheels creaked, hoofs struck the ground in steady rhythm. Somewhere in that slow-moving train of wagons, a 16-year-old boy with bowed legs and a stubborn heart took his first true steps toward the person the world would one day call KitCarson. He was not a legend yet. He was not even sure he belonged there. He was just a runaway saddler's apprentice walking west, carrying more questions than answers and learning with every mile that the frontier does not care what shape your legs are. It only cares whether you can endure. And this boy was determined to endure. The wagons rolled west with the slow, grinding rhythm of something too heavy to ever really stop. Dust hung in the air behind them like a long, pale banner. The men walked or rode in loose groups, sometimes joking, sometimes silent, always with one eye on the horizon. Somewhere in the line, Christopher Carson, still not Kit to anyone, put one sore foot in front of the other and tried not to limp. The trail did not care that he was young. It did not care that his legs bowed outward or that he had run away from a life other people thought was good enough for him. The trail only demanded the same things from him that it demanded from everyone else: keep moving or fall behind. He felt the truth of that by the end of the first day. By the time the sun sank, every part of him hurt. His shoulders ached from shifting loads, rolling barrels, pushing a wagon when the wheels sank deep into mud. His hands stung from rope burns. His back felt like someone had hammered nails down his spine. The men around him were no gentler than the work. "Keep up, boy," one called. "Trail ain't gonna slow down for your chicken legs." They laughed, but it wasn't cruel the way boys sometimes are. It was simply the language of men who had seen enough of the world to know. Complaining doesn't change the miles ahead. At camp that night, Christopher ate quickly, grateful for any food at all. Beans, salted meat, hard bread. He would have paid gold to lie down, but there was always something to do: animals to hobble, fires to tend, guards to set. And then, almost as if to mock the ache in his limbs, came the stories. Men folded blankets near the fire and talked about the road ahead, the Cimarron cutoff, where water could disappear for terrifying stretches. The long slope toward New Mexico, where the land opened up in wide, exposed plains. The storms that came screaming out of nowhere, turning a quiet evening into a battle with lightning and wind. Christopher listened, eyes half closed, feeling fear and excitement twist together inside him. Every tale reminded him how easily this adventure could end in a shallow grave. And every tale made him more certain he had been right to leave. Because out here, for the first time, his body's weaknesses felt almost irrelevant. No one cared what he looked like. They cared whether he could do the work, whether he could hold the line when things went bad. He meant to prove that he could. Days blurred into a pattern: walk, work, watch, sleep in snatches. The landscape changed, trees thinning out, hills flattening, the sky growing wider. Heat pressed down during the day. Cold slid under blankets at night. Sometimes the trail followed a river, the sound of water giving everyone a sense of comfort. Other times, the wagons moved through stretches so dry and empty that even the men's laughter seemed to dry up. Christopher learned fast. He learned how to loop a rope around a balky mule's muzzle just tight enough to make it obey without cutting into flesh. He learned which clouds meant a quick shower and which meant a storm that could blow wagons over. He learned how to stamp a fire properly so the wind wouldn't carry a stray spark across the grass and turn the whole world around them into an oven. Men began to notice. "Not bad for a shop rat," one muleteer admitted after Christopher helped steady a wagon on a steep, crumbling bank. "Maybe you're built for the road after all." Those small comments mattered. Each one was like an extra nail hammered into the steps of a ladder he was trying to climb out of his past life. At the same time, he started to learn another language, the language of danger. Tracks in the dust that weren't theirs. A dead quiet that fell over the animals for no clear reason. Smoke on the horizon that might be another caravan. Or something else. The men told him about raids, about times when parties of native warriors had attacked, taking horses, mules, and lives in fast, brutal strikes. They spoke of it with a mix of fear and anger, but also with a kind of twisted respect. "They ride like the devil," one older teamster said, staring out into the dark. "Know this land better than any of us." Christopher listened carefully. He noticed how often the stories left out important details, like why a particular band might have attacked, or what promises had been broken before arrows ever flew. Out here on the trail, the world was usually split into simple halves, us and them, safe and danger, alive and dead. He didn't have the education to argue with that. He just stored it away, piece by piece, without knowing how much it would shape him later. Weeks later, when the caravan finally rolled into Santa Fe, Christopher's head was spinning. The town was unlike anything he had seen. Adobe houses, narrow, dusty streets, people speaking Spanish and native languages he didn't understand, colorful blankets, silver, strange hats and jewelry, bells ringing from a church tower. The air itself felt different, drier, thinner, tinged with smoke and animals and spices. He had left a saddle shop in Missouri. He had walked into another world. The traders set to work bargaining and unloading. Some would turn around and head back with new goods. Others would stay a while or disappear farther south, chasing more profit. Christopher did what he had been hired to do. He hauled loads, followed orders, slept where he could find space. But underneath the daily tasks, a question slowly took shape. Should he go back? By the terms of his apprenticeship, he was supposed to. He had run away. There was still a master back in Franklin with a legal claim on him, a man who had printed a mocking notice trying to call him home. The thought of stepping back into that shop, of picking up those same tools, made his chest feel tight. He had crossed hundreds of miles. He had faced thirst, fear, exhaustion. He had seen sunrise on empty plains and watched the stars spread across the sky like spilled salt, so bright it felt like you could walk right into them. He was not the same boy who had slipped away from the bench and the needles. The men around him could see it too. "You headed back, Carson?" one asked, halfway through a shared jug of whatever liquor they had scrounged. "I don't reckon I am," he answered quietly. The words didn't feel like rebellion anymore. They felt like a simple statement of fact. If he went back, he would always be the runaway. The boy who tried the trail and couldn't cut it. If he stayed in the West, he could become something else. He didn't know what yet, but he knew better than to turn away from the chance. Over the next months and years, the West itself became his teacher. He found work as a teamster, a cook, a hunter, whatever was needed. He followed caravans back and forth. He pushed deeper into territories that most Americans of his time would only ever see as lines on a map along the way. He began to meet men whose names would never be printed on dime novels, but who were legends of a different kind, trappers and mountain men. They wore buckskin clothes stiff with sweat and time. Their hair was long, their beards wild. They smelled like smoke, animals, and old leather. Many of them could not read or write, but they knew the shape of mountain ranges the way. Other men knew the shape of letters. They told stories of the Rocky Mountains, of winter camps where snow buried tents to the flap, of rivers rich with beaver the animal whose pelts were the gold of that era. They talked about rendezvous, big annual gatherings where trappers and traders sold their furs, bought supplies, and drank and gambled until the money was gone. Christopher's ears pricked up. The life they described was dangerous, yes. Men froze, drowned, were attacked by animals or enemies, or simply vanished in the wilderness. But those who survived became tough as rawhide and as self-reliant as wolves. To someone who had grown up feeling small, overlooked, and confined to other people's plans, the idea of becoming a mountain man sounded less like madness and more like a test. Could he do it? Could the bow-legged boy from Kentucky live in that world and not just die in it? He decided to find out. It began with small steps. He attached himself to more experienced trappers, offering whatever labor he could, cooking, carrying, guarding camp. In return, he watched and listened. He paid attention to how they set steel traps in the right channels, how they read weather signs on high peaks, how they chose shelter when storms rolled in fast. He learned to ride better, his bent legs gripping the horse's sides in a way that, surprisingly, made him quite stable in the saddle. What had once made him the butt of jokes now became almost an advantage. He could stick to a horse over bad ground like a burr to a blanket. Nights around the fire were schools of their own. Men would argue about the best pass through a certain range, about which tribes were friendly to trade and which were more likely to attack, about where the beaver had grown scarce and where a man might still strike it rich. Sometimes the talk turned to blood. "He came at me with a knife," one man would insist, miming the motion. What was I supposed to do? Stand there? Others would nod grimly. The line between defense and aggression blurred easily in those tailies, especially after enough whiskey. But to the young listener soaking it all in, the message was simple. In this world, hesitation kills. The wilderness around them drove that lesson home. Storms slammed into the camps with no warning, flattening tents and sending embers flying. Rivers rose and fell, turning crossings from mild to deadly in hours. Once, as they crossed a high pass, a wall of white suddenly swept down the slope, a snowslide that roared like thunder. They barely had time to scramble out of the way, shouting, grabbing at packs and animals. In the chaos, one mule slipped. Its hooves scraped for purchase, then vanished over the edge. The scream of the animal and the crash of its body below echoed long after the snow settled. Christopher stood there, chest heaving, cold biting his face, and understood at a level deeper than words. Out here, the land itself was an enemy as much as any man, and yet he stayed. Every test he passed, every storm survived, every river crossed, every close call burned away a little more of the boy he had been. In his place, something leaner and harder was forming. There came a day when one of the older trappers, packing up camp, called out almost carelessly, "Carson, you know this stretch better than me. You ride point." The words hit him like a physical blow. A physical blow. He looked up, waiting for the man to smirk, to say it was a joke. No joke came. The others were already tightening cinches and checking rifles, acting as if his new role were obvious. He turned his horse toward the open land and rode ahead. He knew where the last good water source had been. He remembered the shape of a distant ridge, the way a smaller hill tucked against it like a child at a parent's side. He aimed for that landmark, trusting his memory, his sense of direction, and whatever instinct he had built out of countless miles. The land didn't suddenly become welcoming. The sky didn't brighten in approval, but the column behind him followed his lead. And when they found a decent camp before nightfall, with enough grass for the animals and enough wood for fires, no one questioned how they'd gotten there. That night, as he sat by the flames, no longer just a helper but someone men relied on, he did not think of saddle shops or apprenticeships. He thought of the miles behind him and the miles ahead. He was still short, still bow-legged, still carrying the scar tissue of a difficult boyhood. But out here, those things no longer defined him. The wilderness had given him a new name in the only language it respected. The man who can find the way. And slowly, in camps and trading posts, on trails and at rendezvous, people who might not even know his given name began to say, with the certainty of those who keep mental lists of who matters and who doesn't, "Take Carson with you. He knows this country." The boy from Kentucky was vanishing, step by step, into the life of a scout, trapper, and mountain man. Soon, history would catch up with him. Wars, expeditions, and bigger forces than any one man could control would drag him into their current. The legend of KitCarson was waiting just beyond the next range. But for now, on cold nights under a too-wide sky, he was simply a young man who had survived his baptism by wilderness and come out changed on the other side. By the early 1840s, the rivers that had made men rich went quiet. Beaver hats were out of fashion in Europe. Prices fell. Trappers who once measured their worth in pelts now measured it in debts. Camps that had buzzed with talk and laughter thinned out. The mountains were still there, but the money that justified freezing and bleeding in them was not. Kit Carson looked around and saw a simple truth. The old life was ending. He could cling to it out of habit. Or he could follow the current of history, the same way he'd once followed hidden streams to water. The West was changing. Maps were being redrawn by men in uniforms and suits, and those men needed someone who knew the land the way city people know streets. In 1842. In St. Louis he met one of them, John C. Fremont. Fremont was everything Kit was not educated, polished, married into political power. He had big plans, official expeditions to chart the far west, to turn rumors and trails into lines on government maps. But between those plans and the land lay danger. For that he needed a guide. People gave him a name, KitCarson. When Fremont first laid eyes on him, it must have been a surprise. No towering hero from a painting stood before him, just a short, square man, slightly bow-legged, with weathered skin and quiet eyes. But Fremont was smart enough to trust results, not appearances. He hired Carson as guide and hunter on that first expedition. Carson led the party through South Pass, the gentle break in the Rockies that would become the doorway for thousands of settlers. To most men, the pass was just another wide valley. To Carson, every bend and bluff carried meaning. He read snow lines, animal trails, and the color of distant ridges the way other men read books. F. Fremont watched, and then he wrote. In his official reports printed back east and eagerly read by people hungry for stories of the frontier, Fremont praised his guide again and again. The words traveled faster than any wagon. In living rooms and city offices, strangers began to repeat a name they'd never heard before. More expeditions followed. Carson guided Fremont through the Great Basin, across deserts and over the Sierra Nevada in winter. Men and animals staggered through snow. Hands went numb on rifle stocks. Nights lasted forever. Somewhere along those ridges, there was a high route that would later bear his name, Carson Pass. A crooked-legged boy from Kentucky now had a piece of the mountains named after him back east. Fremont's reports were not the only thing spreading the story. Dime novels, cheap, thrilling little books grabbed onto Carson's name like a dog onto a bone. In their pages, he single-handedly fought off hordes of enemies. Never missed, never hesitated, never doubted. The real Carson couldn't even read most of what they wrote. He was still largely illiterate, embarrassed by the fact, signing his name with a shaky C. Carson when he had to. Often, someone would read the stories aloud to him in camp. He would listen, frown, and mutter things like, never happened, or they laid it on a little too thick. But the country didn't want the complicated truth. It wanted a myth. Then came war. In 1846. The United States and Mexico plunged into the Mexican-American War. Flags changed. Armies marched. The West became not just a place to explore, but a prize to be seized. Carson followed Fremont into California, where a handful of American settlers staged the Bear Flag Revolt, declaring a short-lived republic before U.S. forces took control. In that messy, shifting conflict, Carson sometimes found himself carrying out orders that had nothing to do with clean, simple heroism. There were executions, skirmishes, and decisions that left gray stains on his conscience, whether he spoke of them or not. Later that same year, he was sent east with dispatches, only to be intercepted by General Stephen Kearny, who ordered him to guide a column of tired soldiers from New Mexico to California. On the way, at San Pasqual, Kearny's force stumbled into a stronger Mexican cavalry. The fight went badly. American soldiers fell, horses died. The survivors dug in on a hill, surrounded and outgunned. In the night, Kearny turned to the man he trusted most. He asked Carson to slip through the enemy lines and bring help from San Diego, miles away. Carson agreed. He and a Navy officer, Edward Beale, and a native scout took off their shoes so the leather wouldn't scrape and crawled barefoot through the dark over rocks, through cactus, past enemy campfires until the sounds of the trapped soldiers faded behind them. They made it. Reinforcements came. Kearny's men were saved. Back east, this story fit perfectly into the legend already forming. Kit Carson, fearless frontier scout, slipping like a ghost through danger to rescue an army. It was told and retold, polished until it shone. The messier parts of the war, the politics, the civilians caught in the middle. The executions faded into the background. After the war, Carson did not retire into quiet. In the 1850s, he served as a U.S. Indian agent in New Mexico, dealing with the Ute, Jicarilla Apache, and others. A man who could barely sign his own name now sat at a desk dictating reports about hunger, stolen livestock, and broken promises between settlers and native nations. Sometimes he fought to get rations and blankets for people the government had pushed into starvation. Sometimes he enforced policies that squeezed them further. The job pulled him in two directions: the mountain man who respected hard, self-reliant people, and the army officer tasked with clearing those same people from land the U.S. wanted. Then, in 1861, the Civil War reached New Mexico. Carson raised and led the first New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry, a regiment of mostly Hispanic and Native soldiers who fought for the Union at battles like Valverde. They helped stop Confederate forces from seizing the Southwest. For a brief moment, the story seemed simple again. Carson, the scout-turned-officer, defending his territory from invaders. But once the Confederate threat faded, the Union Army turned back to its older, unfinished business. The native nations of the Southwest. In 1863, under the command of General James Carleton, Carson was ordered to break the resistance of the Navajo. The strategy was brutal and clear: burn everything. Carson's troops swept through Navajo country, destroying fields, hogans, orchards, flocks, and water sources. Peach trees in places like Canyon de Chelly, planted and tended for generations, were cut down. Sheep and goats were slaughtered. Smoke from burning homes stained the sky. The goal wasn't just to win battles. It was to make survival itself impossible. Starving and desperate, thousands of Navajos surrendered, believing that turning themselves in might spare their families. In 1864, roughly 8,000 dying men, women, and children were forced to march up to 300 miles from their homelands to a barren reservation at Bosque Redondo. This ordeal became known as the Long Walk. People collapsed along the way. Those who couldn't keep up were sometimes shot. Children cried in languages their guards didn't understand. The land they were leaving behind: canyons, springs, mountains tied to their stories, and prayers receded behind them like a world sinking under water. Carson did not march at the head of every column, but he had helped make the Long Walk possible. He had led the campaigns that cleared the way. He had followed orders that tore a nation from its home. Some later accounts say he disliked Carleton's harshest orders, that he argued for better treatment at Bosque Redondo. Others say his loyalty to command outweighed personal doubt. The truth, as with so much in his life, lies tangled in conflicting memories and missing lines in official reports. What does remain clear is this: while Dine novels back east still praised Kit Carson, Indian fighter, the Dine remembered him very differently. The legend was nearing its brightest point. The shadow it cast was long after the Navajo campaign. Carson was promoted to brevet brigadier general, a fancy title for a man who still preferred plainclothes and simple words. He took command at Fort Garland in what is now Colorado, responsible for keeping peace in a region buzzing with miners, settlers, and native nations all crammed together. On paper, it was a high honor. In his body, the cost of all those years began to show. He was not old by our standards, only in his 50s, but a lifetime of wounds. Hunger, cold, and hard riding had aged him early. His chest hurt. His breathing came shorter. The land he had once crossed in long, tireless strides now seemed to weigh on him. If you had visited his post then, you might have seen a man who looked almost ordinary, about 5.5 feet tall, slightly stooped, with light hair and soft blue eyes. Many people who met him for the first time were shocked. This was the terrifying figure from the storybooks. This quiet, polite man who answered questions in short sentences and didn't brag about his exploits. For all his fame, Carson remained deeply self-conscious about his illiteracy. He could sign his name slowly and read a little, but long documents and letters still had to be read to him. Sometimes friends would sit and read poetry or novels aloud by lamplight. He liked outdoor stories, landscapes painted with words. The irony was sharp. The man who had inspired countless pages of dramatic fiction could barely read them himself. At home, in Teos, life was fuller and warmer. Years earlier, he had married Josefa Jaramillo, a Mexican woman from a respected local family. Together, they had a bustling household of children, his own and some adopted, who filled the rooms with noise that had nothing to do with war or marching orders. Neighbors remembered him as a kind, if sometimes distant, father, a man who worked hard, honored his commitments, and rarely raised his voice. He went to Mass, he helped with chores. He tried, in whatever way he understood, to provide his family with a gentler life than the one he had known, but the world beyond his front door would not let him be just a husband and father. Newspapers still printed his name. Biographers came, eager to pin his memories to paper. Some wanted honesty. Others wanted another layer of shine for the legend. A few listened as he told stories in plain, unadorned language, then improved them in writing until he barely recognized himself on the page. More than once, after hearing a passage read aloud, he shook his head and said the author had laid it on a little too thick. Meanwhile, Far from Taos and Fort Garland, different conversations were beginning. Among the Navajo Dine, the name KitCarson sat inside stories of burned orchards, dead sheep, and the terrible miles of the Long Walk. Among some Anglos and Hispanos, he was a patriot and defender of settlers. Among others, he was a tool of expansion, a man who had helped push older nations off their lands. Two Carsons took shape in memory: the mythic Kit Carson mountain man, scout, fearless rider, moral symbol of the winning of the West; the human Christopher Carson, bow-legged boy, runaway apprentice, skilled survivor, participant in campaigns that brought both glory and grief; the man himself, sitting by a fire in a drafty fort or in a modest Taos home, lived somewhere between those two shadows. In April 1868, his world cracked in a more personal way. His wife, Josepha, died shortly after giving birth to their last child. He was devastated. Friends said he moved like a man with a weight tied to his chest. The house, once noisy, felt wrong, too quiet where her voice should have been, too loud where grief echoed in the children's cries. Only a few weeks later, Carson's own body finally failed him. On May 23, 1868, at Fort Lyon in Colorado Territory, he died of an aortic aneurysm, essentially a fatal burst in one of the main vessels leaving his heart. He was 58 years old. His last reported words were simple and practical, addressed to a doctor holding his hand. "Doctor, compadre, adios." They took his body back to Taos to be buried beside Josepha. On the gravestone, the name that had traveled so far and been twisted so many ways was carved in stillness: Kit Carson. In the years after his death, the legend only grew. Towns, counties, and even a state capital, Carson City, Nevada, bore his name. Statues went up. School children acted out simplified versions of his adventures. Writers and filmmakers used him as a symbol of the frontier spirit, often ignoring or softening the darkest chapters of his life. Later historians, native scholars, and community voices began pulling the other side of the story into the light. The Navajo homes burned. The Mescalero Apache forced to Bosque Redondo, the Long Walk and its graves along the trail. They asked hard questions about responsibility, obedience, and the human cost of taming the West. And that is where we, as viewers and listeners, find him now, not standing cleanly on a pedestal, but balancing on a narrow ridge between admiration and condemnation. The question is no longer just, was Kit Carson a hero? Or was he a villain? The better question is, what does his life tell us about the world that made him and the stories we choose to tell about that world? He began as a bow-legged boy who refused to accept the limits others set for him. He survived wilderness, war, and politics. He helped people live and helped people suffer. He became a symbol for a country still struggling to understand its own history. As the firelight fades on his story, we're left with a choice. Do we cling to the easy legend, the fearless scout who led the way? Or do we look at the full picture, the courage, the cruelty, the loneliness, the loyalty, the harm, and the hunger for something more that drove him west in the first place? That choice is ours. And it's the choice this channel will keep putting in front of you, story after story, as we return to the darker corners of history and ask, again and again, who were these people really beneath the myths we built around their names?